Late spring had come soft to the valley, brushing the hills with the tender green of forgiveness. The wind smelled of wet clay and wild lilac, and every creek ran fuller than it had in years. Down by Willow Creek, the ranch lay quiet, its fences gray and leaning, its barn door hanging by one hinge like a tired old jaw. A man rode across that stillness, his hat pulled low, his eyes the color of worn river stone. Jackson Turner had learned to live with silence. It spoke to him clearer than people ever had. He'd been alone 5 winters since the fever took his wife. Folks in town said he'd aged twice that in sorrow, though no one had ever heard him speak of it. The ranch had outlasted him, it seemed, still breathing, still stretching under the weight of the sky. But even the cattle moved slow these days, as if waiting for something that never came. Jackson stopped at the edge of his field where a few fence posts leaned like drunks after Sunday service. He dismounted, set his hands to the wood, and worked quietly until his palms stung. The work wasn't about mending fences anymore, it was about keeping grief from eating him whole. Somewhere far off, he heard laughter echo down the dirt road from town, and it struck him like the memory of music in a house long emptied. That evening he hitched his horse and rode toward Silver Run. It was market day. The main street buzzed with wagons, gossip, and the creak of wagon wheels over dust. Jackson never lingered long in crowds, but a notice nailed crooked to the post outside the mercantile caught his eye. Help wanted, cooks for hire, dismissed from Hensley Ranch. The name Hensley soured his stomach. Clyde Hensley was a man with money and meanness in equal measure. He ruled his land the way a snake guards its den, by fear. It wasn't the first time Clyde had thrown help off his property. Rumor had it 2 young women had been tossed out that morning for stealing food. Inside the store, Jackson found Mrs. Beck, the merchant's wife, already whispering over the tale. "One's a China woman," she said, her tone sharp with judgment. "The other, white but poor. Worked for Hensley's wife till she broke a plate. He says they both took silver spoons." Jackson set his jaw. "You see them steal?" Mrs. Beck blinked. "Course not. But Clyde don't lie." He nodded slowly, though something in his chest twisted. "No," he said at last, "men like him don't lie, they just don't see far enough to know the truth." He left the store with 2 sacks of flour and a thought that wouldn't settle. As he led his horse down the back road, he spotted them near the well behind the livery, 2 figures sitting on a crate in the fading light. One wore a torn homespun dress, hair tangled from wind. The other, smaller, her black hair pinned neatly though her sleeves were scorched from stove grease. They looked like they were trying not to take up space. Jackson approached slowly, hat in hand. "You 2 from Hensley's place?" The settler girl looked up first. Her eyes were rimmed red, but her voice held a hint of iron. "We're no one's any more, sir. He turned us out." The Chinese girl bowed her head slightly, speaking soft but steady. "We did not steal. We only cook. But mistress angry. Throw rice, throw words." Jackson studied them in the dying light, the bruised dignity in their posture, the stubborn flicker that hadn't gone out. He saw weariness he knew well. "I ain't got much," he said, "but my place could use a cook or 2 if you don't mind the quiet." The settler girl hesitated. "You don't know us." "I know what it's like to be talked about," he replied. Something fragile passed between them then, trust offered, not claimed. The smaller woman looked at her companion, then at Jackson. "We can work," she said simply. By the time they climbed into his wagon, the sun was low, washing the road in molten gold. The air smelled of dust and lilac and the faint, nervous hope of a new beginning. Neither woman spoke much on the ride. Sarah Boone, he learned her name when he asked softly, held her apron tight around her shoulders. Jing Lin sat straight as a candle, hands folded in her lap, eyes watching every turn of the land as though memorizing it. The wheels creaked over shallow ruts. A hawk drifted above the hills. They passed a meadow where calves nursed in twilight. The world seemed to hold its breath, letting the sound of horses and wind speak what none of them could. Jackson thought of what the neighbors might say, how they'd whisper of impropriety, how men like Clyde Hensley would sneer that he'd taken in strays. But loneliness had carved too deep in him for fear of talk to matter anymore. He only knew the look in those women's eyes, the look of people who'd been told too often they were less than human. He'd worn that same look once, standing over a grave. When the wagon reached the ridge, the ranch came into view, humble, half-broken, bathed in the last honeyed light of day. The fences cast long shadows like open arms across the fields. Jing Lin leaned forward. "It is very quiet here," she murmured. Jackson nodded. "Quiet's all I got to give." Sarah smiled faintly, the first he'd seen. "After where we came from, quiet sounds like heaven." They rolled into the yard just as night gathered. Fireflies blinked near the porch, the smell of rain far off in the air. Jed Marsh, Jackson's old foreman, stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He froze at the sight of the women, his gray brows lifting. "You bringin' me trouble, Eli?" Jackson dismounted. "Maybe. But I figure trouble's better company than ghosts." Jed chuckled low. "If they can cook better than you, I won't complain." Sarah laughed under her breath, surprised by the sound of it. Jing Lin climbed down from the wagon, her bare feet touching the dust like it was sacred ground. She looked toward the open doorway of the house, the worn table, the cracked hearth, the single chair that hadn't been moved in years, and she whispered something in Chinese that the wind carried off. Jackson didn't ask what it meant. He only felt the air change, as if the house itself had taken a breath after a long silence. They carried the sacks inside. A lamp flickered to life, filling the kitchen with warm amber glow. For the first time in years, the house looked lived in again. Outside, thunder grumbled softly beyond the hills. The smell of lilac deepened, and the night grew still except for the rhythmic creak of the weathered barn door. Jackson stood in the threshold, watching the two women begin to move through his house like careful ghosts learning the space of the living. He didn't yet know what shape their presence would take in his life, only that the silence he'd clung to for so long no longer felt like peace. It felt like the edge of something about to begin. And as lightning flared far off across the prairie, Jackson Turner realized, without a word spoken, that his lonely ranch had just changed forever. Morning came quiet and blue over Willow Creek Ranch, the mist curling low like breath against the valley. The smell of damp hay and wood smoke rose through the air, and from the kitchen came a faint clatter, the sound of new life settling into old walls. Jackson Turner stepped from the porch, hat in hand, listening. He hadn't heard that kind of sound in years. Not since the fever took his wife and the laughter went out with her. Through the open door he saw Sarah Boone standing at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied in a loose braid. Steam rose from a pot of coffee, and beside her Jing Lin knelt near the hearth, coaxing flame from the embers with patient care. The two women worked without many words, but there was rhythm between them, an unspoken grace that filled the silence like music played soft enough to heal something inside. Jackson lingered in the doorway. It felt almost wrong to step inside, as though he might scare the moment off if he breathed too loud. Sarah looked up first, catching his shadow against the frame. "Coffee'll be ready soon," she said, voice quiet but steady. He nodded, brushing dust from his coat. "Smells better than I've had in a long time." Jing Lin rose, turning with a small smile. "We find flour. Make bread later. Not fancy but good." Her English was careful, each word measured like a stone placed on a bridge. Jackson felt something stir in him. Not pity, not yet admiration either, but the sense of watching courage dressed in gentleness. "Bread sounds fine," he murmured. They ate together at the worn pine table, sunlight pooling through the window. Sarah passed him a plate without meeting his eyes. The silence wasn't awkward, it was tender, like everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing and breaking it. The kittens mewed under the porch boards outside, faint reminders of soft lives surviving rough land. After breakfast, Jackson set out to the pastures, and to his quiet surprise they followed. Sarah walked with a slight limp from an old bruise, but she kept pace, holding a bucket of grain. Jing Lin carried a pail of milk and glanced around the valley as if memorizing each tree. "Why'd you stay on with Hensley?" Jackson asked when they reached the corral. Sarah's mouth tightened. "Where else was there to go?" she said simply. "You don't get many choices when folks see you as help before they see you as human." Jing Lin looked down, fingers tracing the handle of the bucket. "Work was bad but hunger worse. I send money to my brother in California. They call me thief now, so letter won't find me." The wind moved through the grass like sighs. Jackson leaned against the fence, watching the mare graze. "You'll find better ground here," he said after a moment. "The land's rough, but it don't lie to you." Sarah gave a short laugh. "You sound like the preacher." He smiled faintly. "Preacher talks too much. I let the work do the talking." For a while that was all it was, work in silence and the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Sarah washed curtains and patched the roof with old burlap. Jing Lin filled the kitchen with smells of ginger and sage and venison, turning plain food into something that reminded Jackson what home could feel like. One afternoon, a soft rain fell over the valley. Jackson was out mending the east fence when he heard laughter, real laughter, coming from the house. He turned to see Sarah chasing a kitten out the door with a broom, slipping on the wet porch. Jing Lin caught her arm just in time, both of them collapsing against the railing in breathless giggles. For a moment, the sound filled the hollow spaces of his heart like sunlight after drought. Later, he found them sitting by the stove, sewing patches into an old quilt that once belonged to his wife. Sarah looked up, hesitant. "We didn't mean to touch her things. We thought maybe you'd like it fixed." He took in the sight, the careful stitching, the bright blue square among the faded cloth. His throat felt tight. "She'd like that," he said, voice low. She always hated leaving things unfinished. That night, the lamp burned late. Jackson worked on the barn roof while the women prepared supper. When he came inside, sweat and sawdust on his skin, the table was already set. A stew fragrant with herbs he couldn't name, fresh bread, wildflowers in a tin cup. Jed Marsh came in from the yard and sniffed the air. "Lord above," he said, grinning at the women. "If you can cook like this every night, I might start believing in miracles again." Sarah smirked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe you ought to say grace before tasting then." Jing Lin hid a smile behind her hand. Jackson caught it, and for the first time in years he found himself smiling too. But peace in the West never stayed long. A week later, word reached them through Jed that Clyde Hensley had been boasting in town, saying Jackson had taken in his thieving girls, that he'd pay for harboring liars. The women went pale when they heard. Sarah's hands trembled so hard she dropped a plate. Jing Lin stood very still, eyes unreadable. "He'll come," Sarah whispered. "He always does when someone won't bow to him." Jackson looked between them, the anger in him rising not fast, but deep and quiet as a river thawing under ice. "Let him talk," he said. "The truth's got stronger legs than lies." Jing Lin's gaze met his. "Truth not always enough," she murmured. "Men like him, he make truth small." Jackson said nothing, but his jaw hardened. Outside, thunder grumbled again, same as the night they'd arrived. Days passed under that uneasy cloud. Sarah worked harder, as though to earn what she already had. Jing Lin spent evenings by the creek, gathering herbs and humming to herself. Jackson caught himself watching her once, the way her reflection trembled in the water like light struggling to stay. He turned away, ashamed at how the sight unsettled him. By the week's end, the ranch had changed. The air felt lived in again, the smell of fresh bread, the faint music of laughter, the scrape of chairs across wood. But beneath it all, tension breathed quiet and sure. One evening, just before dusk, Jackson came back from the pasture to find Sarah and Jing Lin on the porch. Sarah held a letter, torn open at the edge. "It's from town," she said softly. "Jed heard from the sheriff. Clyde's filed a claim, says we stole silver from his wife's table." The paper trembled in her hand. Jing Lin's eyes glistened though she blinked the tears away before they fell. Jackson reached for the letter, read the messy ink, then folded it slow. "We'll ride in tomorrow," he said. "You won't face it alone." Jing Lin looked at him then, not with fear but something deeper, a fragile faith trying to take root. Sarah turned her face to the horizon, where the first stars blinked through the purple sky. Inside, the lamp still burned. Outside, crickets began their slow chorus. The ranch that had been dead for years now pulsed with fragile life, and yet, just beyond the fence line, trouble waited, patient as a wolf in the tall grass. Jackson stared into that dark distance and knew, the quiet they built was about to be tested. The morning they rode into town, the air was cool and bright, the kind of light that made everything look freshly made, every fence post sharp, every leaf awake. Jackson Turner guided the wagon down the dirt road, reins steady in his calloused hands. Sarah Boone sat beside him, pale and quiet, while Jing Lin sat in the back with her shawl drawn up, watching the horizon. The valley stretched behind them like a secret too beautiful to tell. But ahead lay Silver Run, and judgment. No one spoke for most of the ride. Only the squeak of wheels and the horse's breath broke the silence. Sarah's fingers kept worrying the edge of her apron, her eyes unfocused. "What if he's there already?" she asked at last. Jackson didn't look at her. "Then we look him in the eye." Jing Lin's voice drifted from the back. "Some eyes see truth, some only what they want." He glanced over his shoulder. "Then we make it so they can't look away." Silver Run appeared slowly, nestled between the bluffs. The saloon's red sign glinted in the sun, and the church bell marked 9 o'clock sharp. They tied the horse outside the sheriff's office. Inside, the air smelled of dust, ink, and something faintly metallic, like fear left too long in a drawer. Sheriff Alcott looked up from his desk, a tired man with honest eyes. "Morning, Jackson," he said. "Heard you've got visitors needing words with me." Jackson tipped his hat. "They're no thieves, Sheriff. I'll stand for them." The sheriff's gaze softened when he saw the women. "No one's saying you're guilty," he said, voice low. "But Clyde's raised a claim. Says he's missing 2 silver spoons and a servant's wage." Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling. He docked our pay 3 months running. Called us thieves because his wife lost her temper. Jing Lin stepped forward, holding something small in her palm. A spoon, tarnished, bent at the handle. This one, she said softly. I keep only one. 4 kittens. They sick. I feed milk. Not for stealing. For saving. The sheriff took it, turning it over in his hand like it weighed more than silver. You understand, miss, he's saying this proves his claim. It prove his cruelty, she whispered. Jackson crossed his arms. You know Clyde, sheriff. How many times you heard this kind of talk? The sheriff sighed. Too many. But he's loud enough to make people listen. From outside came the rattle of spurs. The door swung open and there he was, Clyde Hensley, sharp suit, clean boots, cruelty polished into pride. I see the fugitives found themselves a savior, he drawled, eyes cutting toward Jackson. Never thought I'd see the day a Turner stooped to keep a liar's company. Jackson didn't move. I keep workers who earn their keep. Clyde smirked. Workers? Or pets? Sarah flinched. Jing Lin's hands clenched in her shawl, though her face remained still as carved stone. The sheriff stood, his patience thinning. Clyde, mind your tongue. You filed your claim. Now let's hear evidence. Evidence? Clyde laughed. You're looking at it. That spoon right there, my wife's. Silver from St. Louis. You think some house girl bought that herself? Maybe she bought it with kindness, Jackson said evenly. Something your house has never had. Clyde's jaw twitched, the smile fading. You'd best watch what you say. The air in the room thickened. The sheriff raised a hand. Enough. I'll hold this matter until Friday. Both parties will attend. If there's proof, we'll see it then. Till that time, no one stirs trouble. Clyde's eyes glittered with something meaner than anger. Oh, I'll be there, he said. And when I am, I'll make sure every soul in this town knows what kind of man hides behind quiet words. He left the door swinging. The silence afterward felt heavy, like a storm crouching just over the ridge. They returned to the wagon. Sarah's face was drawn, Jing Lin silent. Halfway home, Jackson stopped by the meadow and let the horse rest. The wind rippled through the grass and a lark sang above them, its voice far too pure for such a day. Sarah stared out across the hills. He'll ruin us, won't he? Jackson leaned on the wheel. You can't ruin people who know who they are. She turned toward him, eyes wet. You don't know men like him. They twist truth till it fits their greed. He met her gaze. Then we'll show the town something he can't twist, Grace. She looked away, unsure whether to believe him. Jing Lin, still sitting in the back, finally spoke. You help us. Why? Jackson thought a long moment. Because someone helped me once and I never thanked them. That night, the ranch sat quiet under a pale moon. The kittens slept in a box by the stove. The smell of stew lingered in the air, thick with sage. Sarah cleaned the table while Jing Lin stood outside watching the stars. Jackson joined her, arms crossed, the air cool around them. You're not afraid of him, are you? She asked without turning. I've seen worse things than a loud man with money, he said. She nodded. In my village, when man like him come, we bow. My father say wind bends but mountain stays. You are mountain, I think. He smiled faintly. A tired one, maybe? You still stand. They fell quiet again, the sound of frogs echoing from the creek. Inside, Sarah hummed softly, a tune from somewhere far away, maybe Missouri, maybe memory. The sound drifted out into the yard, weaving between them like smoke. When Jackson finally turned in for the night, sleep didn't come. He lay awake, the words of Clyde's threat circling in his mind. For years he'd built his peace on silence, on staying small. But now 2 women's lives sat under his roof, and silence felt like cowardice. Near midnight, thunder rumbled faintly from the east. He rose, stepped outside, and found Jing Lin still by the porch, wrapped in her shawl. You should sleep, he said. She looked up. Sleep don't come when heart afraid. Then you and I share that much. She hesitated, then asked softly, what if we lose? He looked toward the dark hills, their outlines sharp against flashes of distant lightning. Losing's not the worst thing. It's living scared that kills a soul. She bowed her head, the lantern light catching the glint of a tear she didn't wipe away. The next morning dawned heavy and gray. Clouds pressed low, and a wind moved through the valley carrying the scent of rain and something sharper, change. Jed came from the barn, frowning. Eli, he said quietly, Clyde's been spreading talk. Says you're keeping women for favors. Says he'll bring men to back his word. Jackson tightened the reins of his horse, every movement measured. Let him bring them. Jed nodded once. You know this could turn ugly. Maybe it's time the truth had some teeth. By evening, the wind rose into a full storm. Sheets of rain slashed the fields. The lamp inside the house flickered as the three of them sat together, waiting for the thunder to pass. Sarah held the kittens close. Jinglin watched the door. A branch cracked outside, startling them all. Jackson rose, hand to the rifle by the wall. Through the roar of the rain came a voice, muffled, angry. "Turner, open up." Jackson met Jinglin's eyes, then Sarah's. Outside, another shout, Clyde's voice closer now. "Let's see if your kindness holds when the dark comes calling." Lightning flashed, white across the windows, and the ranch, so newly alive, stood trembling on the edge of storm and reckoning. The wind screamed across the valley like a creature torn from its sleep. Rain hammered the earth, turning the yard of Willow Creek Ranch into a shallow lake of brown water. Lightning burned white behind the clouds, and thunder followed close, rolling across the hills like the growl of an ancient beast. Jackson Turner stood by the door with the rifle in his hand, heart steady though the air around him trembled. Outside, through the blur of rain, several shadows moved. Men on horseback, their outlines ghosted by the storm. The voice that rose above the thunder was unmistakable. Clyde Hensley, cruel and calm, shouting from the dark. "Come out, Turner. You've got something that belongs to me." Sarah clutched the kittens to her chest, eyes wide, while Jinglin stood near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tight but her face unflinching. Jackson motioned for them to stay back and stepped onto the porch, rain pelting his shoulders like thrown stones. "I told you before, Hensley," he called out. "They're not yours. They never were." Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat, Jackson saw Clyde clearly, a smirk glistening under his hat brim, his coat dripping, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Two ranch hands flanked him, one holding a lantern, the other a whip. "You think you're a savior now?" Clyde shouted. "A man like you taking in strays like them, it don't sit right with decent folk." Jackson's jaw tightened. Maybe decent folk ought to learn what decency means. Clyde's grin slipped. "You calling me indecent, Turner?" "I'm calling you cruel." The rain came harder, flattening the grass, filling the silence between them. Then, like a match to dry wood, Clyde's anger caught fire. "You've got till dawn to bring them back to my land, or I'll take what's mine by force. You can't hide behind pity forever." He turned his horse with a snap of reins, the other men following, their lanterns bobbing away into the darkness until the only sound left was the storm itself. Jackson watched them vanish, chest heaving, the rifle heavy in his hands. When he stepped back inside, both women looked up, one with fear, the other with quiet understanding. "What did he say?" Sarah whispered. Jackson leaned the rifle by the door. "He's coming back." Dawn. Silence hung like fog. The fire crackled low. Jinglin moved first, taking the kettle from the hearth and pouring tea into a chipped mug. She handed it to him, her hands trembling only slightly. "You fight before?" she asked softly. Jackson nodded once. "I fought storms, sickness, hunger. Men too when it came to that." Her eyes searched his face. "Then you know, fighting never ends clean." He met her gaze, the lamplight painting gold across her cheekbones. "Nothing worth keeping ever does." Sarah sank into the corner chair, tears welling. "Maybe we should leave," she said. "We'll pack tonight, go south before sunrise." Jackson looked at her, then at Jinglin. "If you run now, you'll spend your life running. You want to start over, you do it standing still." The rain slowed by midnight, leaving the world soaked and shivering. They slept little. Jackson kept watch by the window, the faint smell of damp wood and smoke filling the air. Jinglin sat across from him, sewing a rip in his coat. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "In my country," she said, "when a man protects a woman, she owes him her life. But I think maybe here, kindness is not about owing." He looked at her hands, the neat stitches, the way her fingers moved like they were mending something larger than fabric. "Kindness doesn't keep score," he said. She smiled faintly. "Then maybe America not so different from home after all." Before dawn, a pink glow bled into the horizon, weak and uncertain. The valley smelled of rain and clay. Jackson stepped outside to saddle the horse, mud sucking at his boots. Jed arrived from the lower pasture, soaked and frowning. "He's serious, Eli," Jed said quietly. "Clyde's been drinking since last night. Got half the town talking." Jackson adjusted the rifle in its holster. "Then I'll give them something worth talking about." By sunrise they rode toward Silver Run. Sarah and Jinglin followed in the wagon, the horse slow from the wet road. The air was sharp, washed clean by the storm. When they reached the saloon-turned-town hall, half the townsfolk were already there, faces tight with curiosity, some with pity, others with doubt. Clyde stood at the center, dry coat, smug eyes, his wife beside him holding a handkerchief like a weapon. Sheriff Alcott stood behind a wooden table. "Let's settle this quick," he said. "Clyde, your claim's been heard. Jackson, you've brought your witnesses." Clyde stepped forward. "These women worked in my house, stole my silver, broke my trust, and now live under this man's roof. If that ain't guilt, I don't know what is." Jackson folded his arms. "You don't know much about guilt, Hensley." Clyde's wife held up the single spoon, its surface dull in the morning light. "This came from my set," she said. "We have witnesses who saw her take it." Sheriff Alcott looked at Jing Lin. "Is this true?" Jing Lin took a step forward. "Yes," she said softly. "I take it, but not for money. For life." The room stilled. "I feed kittens with it," she continued, voice trembling. "They hungry, small, dying. I feed milk when mistress say no. For that she hit me. For that she call me thief." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The sheriff looked uncertain. Clyde scoffed. "You expect anyone to believe that?" Sarah stepped forward now, her chin high though her hands shook. "She's telling the truth. I saw it. Those kittens are alive because of her. You'd have thrown them in the river." Clyde's face twisted. "You do well to hold your tongue, girl." But Jackson was already stepping between them, his voice low but carrying through the room. "You've built your land on fear, Clyde. Maybe it's time someone showed you what courage looks like." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Then Jed's rough voice rose from the back. "I seen them kittens myself. Jing Lin ain't no thief." One by one, others began to nod. Mrs. Beck, the merchant's wife, looked down, ashamed. The sheriff cleared his throat. "I see no crime here. Case dismissed." Clyde's jaw worked soundlessly. "You can't just." "I can," said the sheriff. "And I will." Clyde's wife turned away, her face pale as milk. Jackson took off his hat, turning to Jing Lin and Sarah. "Let's go home." As they stepped into the sunlight, a cheer, soft but sincere, rose from the crowd. Clyde stood frozen in the doorway, rage trembling in his fists. Jackson met his eyes once more. "You can keep your silver," he said quietly. "We've got something worth more." They left town without looking back. The road home was long and quiet, the wagon wheels creaking over damp earth. Sarah leaned back against the seat, exhausted. Jing Lin held her shawl tight, staring at the hills as though she'd never seen the world so wide. When the ranch came into view, Jackson exhaled. The fences glistened with rain, the air rich with wildflower scent. It felt different now, like a place that had been baptized by courage. But as they reached the gate, Jed rode up from the far trail, breathless, his face pale. "Eli," he said, voice hoarse. "You best come quick. Clyde's barn's on fire. Folks say it's spreading toward the ridge. If it jumps that creek, it'll take your land next." Jackson looked toward the horizon. Smoke rose in the distance, black and thick, curling against the blue sky. Sarah gasped. Jing Lin turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "What will you do?" Jackson swung into the saddle, eyes fixed on the burning hills. "What any man ought to do," he said. "Help him even if he'd never help me." Then he kicked the horse forward, riding toward the fire, toward the man who tried to destroy him, and the test that would decide who Jackson Turner truly was. The air smelled of smoke and wet cedar as Jackson Turner rode hard across the ridge. The horse's hooves tore up mud, its flanks slick with sweat and rain. Smoke rose thick and black ahead, twisting against the morning sky like some terrible prayer. Wind shoved at him, carrying the heat of a fire too near to reason. His heart pounded, not from fear for his own land, but for what it would mean to ride toward the man who'd sworn himself his enemy. When he crested the hill, the world below looked like judgment. Clyde Hensley's ranch was ablaze, the barn a skeleton of beams wrapped in flame, horses screaming in the paddock, men running like shadows through red light. The smell of burning hay and pitch tore through Jackson's chest. For a moment, the wind shifted and he thought he heard someone shouting his name. He spurred the horse down the slope, mud splashing high around him. Men turned at the sound of his approach, eyes wide, faces ghosted with soot. "Get those horses clear," he shouted, sliding from the saddle before the horse stopped. "Water lines, now." Clyde appeared through the smoke, coughing, face streaked black. When he saw Jackson, disbelief flashed in his eyes. What in God's name are you doing here?" Jackson didn't answer. He ran straight for the burning barn. The doors had half collapsed inward, flames licking out in ribbons. Inside, trapped and crying, a mare kicked against a fallen beam. He tore off his coat, threw it over his head and plunged into the heat. The fire breathed around him, alive, hungry. He found the mare's halter, tugged once, twice, she wouldn't move. He heaved the beam aside, muscles screaming, skin searing with heat. Then the animal burst free, wild-eyed, nearly trampling him as she fled into daylight. Jackson stumbled after her, choking, his arms burning. Clyde was there at the door, grabbing his shoulder, hauling him out. "You're mad, Turner. You'll die in there." Jackson coughed, spitting ash. "Then let's both die doing something right." Together they turned toward the water line, forming a chain with the others. Bucket after bucket passed, the fire hissing in protest. Hours blurred into a fever of movement and smoke. The barn groaned, sagged, then collapsed in a shower of sparks, the sound like a mountain breaking. When it was finally done, when the last ember hissed into silence, both men stood soaked, filthy, shaking. The morning sun broke through what was left of the smoke, casting gold across the ruin. Horses milled nearby, snorting and trembling. One of Clyde's men muttered something about a lamp, about spilled kerosene, but no one truly knew how the fire began. Jackson looked at Clyde, whose face had gone strangely still. "You'll rebuild?" he said quietly. Clyde stared at the wreckage, eyes hollow. "There's nothing left to build with." Jackson glanced back at the ridge where his own land lay beyond. "Then come take what you need from mine." The older man turned toward him, disbelief and shame warring in his expression. "After all I've done to you? After what I called you?" Jackson shrugged, too tired for anger. "Hate's heavy, Hensley. I've carried it before. It breaks a man's back before it breaks his enemies." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of cooling ash. Then Clyde sank to his knees beside the charred remains of the barn, his voice low, broken. "I never meant for it to come to this. I wanted people to remember my name." "They will," Jackson said. "But maybe for something different now." When he turned to leave, the sun was climbing higher, painting the valley in light that felt too bright for the night they'd come through. Back at Willow Creek Ranch, the women waited by the gate, their faces pale with worry. Sarah ran forward first, her apron streaked with dirt, tears already gathering. "You're hurt," she said, touching his sleeve, seeing the burns. "Nothing that won't heal," he answered. Jing Lin stepped close then, her voice trembling but calm. "You went for him." Jackson nodded. "Fire doesn't care who started it, only who's brave enough to fight it." Her eyes searched his, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet reverence, an understanding that this man had chosen mercy where vengeance would have been easier. She reached up, gently brushing soot from his cheek. "In my village, they say when a man saves the one who wronged him, he buys peace for his next life." He smiled faintly. "I'm more interested in fixing this one." They walked toward the porch. The storm had washed everything clean, the grass bright with dew, the sky pure as glass. The house smelled of bread and pine smoke. For the first time in years, Jackson felt like the land itself was breathing with him. Sarah followed them in, setting a kettle on the stove. "So what now?" she asked. "Clyde's lost everything. The town will be talking again." "Let them talk," Jackson said. "They'll find truth sooner or later. It has a way of outlasting gossip." Jing Lin laid her shawl across a chair, glancing toward the open door. The fire could have taken this place too. Maybe it was warning. Jackson looked out over the fields, the wind stirring the wildflowers. "Maybe it was reminder," he murmured, "that life's too short for bitterness." For the next few days, neighbors came to help. They brought lumber, food, even laughter. Jed teased Sarah for her stew being too salty. She threw a rag at him, laughing through tears. Jing Lin taught the children who visited how to fold paper birds from scraps of newsprint. At dusk, the valley shimmered with them, tiny white cranes strung on string, fluttering in the breeze like spirits of gratitude. One evening, Jackson found Jing Lin sitting by the creek, her bare feet in the water, her hair unbound. The sun was setting behind her, turning the surface to gold. She looked up when she heard him. "Clyde came by today," he said. "Brought back the silver spoon. Said his wife wanted to thank you." She smiled softly, disbelief shadowing her face. "Strange world." He sat beside her, the earth cool under his palms. "Maybe not strange. Just healing." They watched the sky deepen to violet. Fireflies blinked above the reeds. The sound of frogs pulsed gently in the distance. "Do you ever think of leaving?" she asked. "Once maybe," he said. "But the world's too wide to keep running. I'd rather build something small that lasts." Jing Lin turned to him then, eyes shining with quiet courage. "Then build it with us." He looked at her for a long time, the words sinking into the place inside him that had been empty too long. He reached for her hand, not quickly but as one reaches for something sacred. She didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm, strong, alive. The next morning dawned soft and golden. Dew clung to the grass and the kittens, now half-grown, chased each other through the yard. Sarah hung laundry on the line, humming an old tune. Jed repaired a fence post, muttering about how peace never lasted but was worth the trouble anyway. Jackson stood on the porch, watching Jing Lin gather herbs by the creek. The wind lifted her hair, the sunlight weaving through it. For a moment, the memory of his late wife flickered, then settled, like a candle whose flame had finally found rest. He walked toward Jing Lin. She turned at the sound, smiling. "You look lighter today," she said. "Maybe I am," he replied. "Maybe this place finally feels like home." She touched his arm gently. "It always was. You just needed someone to remind you how to live in it." Behind them, the bell from Silver Run Church rang faintly across the valley, a call to mourning, to forgiveness, to beginning again. Later that evening, the three of them stood on the porch watching the sky blaze with color. The fire that once threatened to destroy them had given way to light that warmed everything it touched. Sarah leaned against the railing, laughing softly. Jing Lin stood beside Jackson, their shoulders barely touching, the space between them humming with quiet certainty. "You think folks will ever stop talking?" Sarah asked. Jackson smiled. "Let them. Some stories are worth being told wrong if it means they're remembered." Jing Lin tilted her head. "And what story will they tell of us?" He looked out over the valley, the land reborn, the fences straight, the hearth alive with smoke. "They'll say a man hired two broken souls," he said, "and they mended him instead." As night fell, the lanterns flickered inside, painting soft light through the windows. The wind carried the scent of bread and lilac. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured again, but it was gentle now, a memory rather than a warning. Jackson reached for Jing Lin's hand once more, the gesture simple, sure. "Come inside," he said. "It's getting cold." She smiled. Home never feels cold again. And when the door closed behind them, the valley settled into silence, peaceful, alive, whole at last.